No one believed a wild horse could love, but a security camera captured it standing motionless all night by the window of an abandoned house, as if guarding the last soul left in the desert. A child, a promise never spoken, and a truth that left all of America silent. Subscribe now to follow more films that reach the deepest corners of your heart. The desert didn't whisper here, it scraped. Every morning began the same way, wind dragging itself across the wooden slats of the fence, like fingernails down a coffin lid. Lyla, 7 years old, bare feet dusty, sat on the porch of the crooked house with the paint peeling like sunburnt skin. Her elbows rested on her knees, chin in hands, listening not for voices, not for footsteps, but for the wind. Behind her, through the creak of the screen door, Alma's voice crackled like a dry fire. "You hear that, baby girl? That's truth. Not what people say, not what they write in them books. The truth's in the wind, if you learn how to hear it." Lyla turned just slightly, enough to catch the glint of her grandmother's cigarette dancing in the dark of the kitchen. Alma rarely left that room anymore. Her back hurt, her knees were bad, but her voice carried like it had roots in the floorboards. "The wind don't lie," Alma said again. "But people do, every damn day." Lyla nodded without answering. Words weren't really her thing. She was more of a watcher, a feeler. She'd learned early that silence gave her more room to breathe. The town, if you could call it that, was a smear of human reluctance on the edge of Nevada's teeth. The kind of place where fences weren't meant to keep things out, but to trap them in. People didn't wave when they passed each other. They eyed, measured, judged, and Lyla, she was the crack in their mirror. Her mother, whose name was no longer spoken in the house, had left before Lyla could walk. Ran off pregnant with some man she never named, maybe never knew. The only thing she left behind was a pair of turquoise earrings and a stack of lies Alma had to burn in the sink. "She didn't leave you," Alma once said, eyes hard as flint. "She left herself." That didn't make sense to Lyla at the time. Maybe it never would. At school, the other children didn't play with her. They called her Ghost Blood or Coyote Baby under their breath, like slurs passed down from their parents' mouths. She didn't fight them. She just stopped going. Alma didn't force her. "They don't deserve your mind," she'd mutter. "We'll make our own lessons." One of Alma's favorite lessons was about horses. "People love horses the same way they love cars," she'd say. "As long as they work, as long as they carry weight. But the moment they stumble, she'd trail off," but Lyla had already seen it with her own eyes. Across the road lived Ellis, a man with leathery skin and mean wrists. He owned 3 horses, kept them in a metal pen with shade no bigger than a napkin. One summer, during a sandstorm, one of the horses collapsed in the dust, refusing to move. Ellis, drunk and furious, beat it with a belt until it bled. Lyla had watched from behind the cracked blinds, Alma gripping her shoulder so tight it left a bruise. "He ain't the worst of 'em," Alma said quietly. "Just the loudest." That night, Lyla couldn't sleep. She kept hearing the sound the horse made, less a scream, more a breaking. By the morning, the horse was gone, replaced a week later like a tire. So, when Alma spoke about the fire horse half-legend, half-scoffed tale from the miners and the old ranchers, Lyla listened harder than she let on. "They say it runs like a storm with a heart, red as blood, eyes like dying suns, shows up when you're most alone." Alma would usually laugh after telling it, flick her ash into a coffee can and add, "But don't believe it, girl. Ain't no such thing as a horse that gives a damn. They're wild things. Like this world. They'll trample you before they save you." But Lyla didn't believe everything Alma said. She believed in the way her skin tingled when the wind changed. She believed in the silence between thunder and rain. She believed in what didn't need proving. She didn't talk to anyone else about it. Not after that one time at the general store. She'd asked the cashier, a woman with stiff hair and stiff lips, if she'd ever seen the fire horse. The woman blinked slow, like she'd just stepped in something sticky. Then she laughed, loud enough for the man behind Lyla to hear. "Oh, honey," the woman said, "that's just dirt people talk, like your grandma's ghost stories." Lyla left her change on the counter and never went back. That afternoon, she sat by the window, the dry glass cool under her fingertips, and drew a flame in the condensation her breath left behind. Not a roaring bonfire, not a campfire, a small, silent flicker. Just enough to be seen, not enough to scare. Alma came in quietly behind her, saw the drawing, and sighed. "You still think about that horse?" Lyla didn't answer. Alma stood there for a moment, one hand on the back of the couch, her eyes older than her face. Then she said, low and brittle, "Don't chase things that ain't meant to be caught, baby girl. Especially not things that don't chase back." Lyla wiped the flame away. The glass stayed cold. Outside, the wind howled again, harder this time, dragging tumbleweeds like broken promises across the dry earth. A cloud of dust lifted near the ridge, swirled, then disappeared. There were no other children playing, no cars passed. The only movement was a hawk, circling too low to mean anything good. Inside the house, Alma's breathing grew raspier. She'd stopped taking her pills, said they made her too quiet. Lyla noticed the way her grandmother moved slower, how the coffee cup shook a little more each morning, how sometimes Alma would sit in her rocker, eyes half shut, murmuring names that belonged to people long buried or long gone. Names like her mother's. Names Lyla never said aloud. One night, the power went out. Just a flicker at first, then silence. Alma lit a candle with shaking hands. The room filled with that sweet burnt smell Lyla loved. She crawled up beside her grandmother, resting her head on Alma's thin shoulder. "You scared?" Alma asked. "No," Lyla said. Alma smiled. "Good. The dark ain't ever been the enemy. It's the things that hide in the light you gotta watch for." Lyla didn't know exactly what that meant, but she remembered it. The next morning, the wind returned, this time full of sand and warnings. The kind of storm that stripped bark off trees and tore tin roofs off chicken coops. Alma made tea, but didn't drink it. She just held it for warmth. "You feel it, baby girl?" she whispered. Lyla nodded. The wind was louder than usual, not angry, just desperate. Later that day, Alma's voice failed her for the first time. Mid-sentence, she coughed, and then kept coughing. She waved Lyla off, said it was nothing. But Lyla could see the pale under her skin, like light leaking through a paper bag. She made Alma lie down, brought her water, sat her beside her, and pressed her palm to her grandmother's chest, feeling the rattle inside. "You're strong," she whispered. But Alma didn't reply. That night, Lyla went back to the window. She pressed her fingers to the glass again. No flame this time. Just a trace of her touch, smudged by the weight of what she didn't have words for. Somewhere out in the dark, something moved. Not the hawk, not the wind, not Ellis's broken truck. Something bigger. But she didn't go to the door. Not yet. She just watched, and waited, and believed. The sun was dropping, bleeding across the edge of the desert like a wound that wouldn't close. Inside the house, Alma tried to stand. The kettle screamed behind her, untouched. Lyla, in the other room, was folding a worn blue blanket the way Alma had taught her corners sharp, edges even. A noise low, thick, wrong stopped her. Thud. Then silence. "Gran?" she called. No answer. She dropped the blanket. Feet slapped the wooden floor as she ran into the kitchen. Alma was on the floor, one arm bent beneath her like it didn't belong to her anymore. Her eyes were open but glassy, her mouth twisted in a grimace that couldn't speak. "Gran." Lyla dropped to her knees. Her hands fluttered uselessly, too small, too late. "Gran, please say something." Nothing. Only the kettle still screamed behind them. She turned it off, hands shaking, and ran to the door. She didn't grab shoes, didn't lock anything, just ran. Out into the red dust of dusk, hair wild behind her, throat raw from screaming her grandmother's name. The wind pushed at her like it wanted her to stop, but she couldn't. She ran to the nearest house, Mr. Ellis's set, banged on the door. Once, twice, harder. Footsteps inside. A shadow moved. Light flooded the window, but the door didn't open. She heard the latch slide into place. Lyla backed away, eyes stinging, heart hammering against her ribs. She ran to the next house, then the next. Every door she knocked on had light inside. Movement, life, but none opened. One door cracked open an inch enough for a voice to slither through. "Go home, child. You shouldn't be out like this." "She needs help," Lyla cried. "Please, my grandma, she's not moving." "Go home," the voice said again, firmer, colder. "We're not getting involved." The door closed, locked. She stood frozen for a moment, not crying. Not yet, just cold. Even in the heat, even in Nevada, something inside her began to retreat, not from fear, but from betrayal. It was then she remembered Alma's warnings, the ones she used to think were just bitterness wearing old clothes. "They don't care about us," Alma had said once, dragging on her cigarette. "You're not one of them. You never will be." Now she understood, but she couldn't stop. Alma was still lying there. She turned and ran again, toward the little market where the neon beer sign blinked, tired red, against the gathering dark. Inside, the air was stale and too cold. A man in a mesh cap glanced at her, then turned away. The woman behind the counter, Sandra, froze when she saw her. "Sandra," Lyla pleaded, panting. "My grandma, please," she fell. And Sandra leaned over the counter slightly, her voice tight. "Where is she?" "At home. She's not moving. Her face is wrong." Sandra's lips thinned. She looked at the man in the cap, then back at Lyla. "She's been sick?" I don't know." Lyla stammered. "She needs a doctor. Please." Sandra stepped back, eyes shifting. She didn't move toward the phone, didn't reach for her keys. "She used to steal from this store, you know," she said to the man beside her, loud enough for Lyla to hear. "Would have thought the girl'd be in foster care by now," the man muttered, crunching a peanut. Sandra leaned down and hissed. "No one even knows who your daddy is, little girl. People around here have enough of their own problems. Go on now, run along." Lyla's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her throat felt like it had swallowed a pine cone. She turned, walked out the store into the dimming heat. This time, she didn't run. This time, her legs were stiff, her back straighter. She walked, across the lot, across the gravel road. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew where she wasn't going back to. She ended up at the edge of a small development, new houses, slightly shinier paint, windows that didn't sag. She had passed it before, on long walks with Alma when her knees were better. These weren't the houses of ghosts and grudges. They were too clean. The door of the first house opened just as she reached the sidewalk. A man stepped out carrying a bag of trash. Young, worn jeans, thin hoodie. He spotted her. "Hey there," he said, surprised. "Are you okay?" Lyla didn't answer. She couldn't play. But her face said everything. It was cracked open, raw, sun pink, and fear pale. Behind the man, the front door creaked again. A woman appeared, younger than Alma, hair tied back, barefoot. "Eric?" she asked. Eric turned to her. "This kid, something's wrong." The woman, Sam, moved forward, gentle but quick. "Sweetheart, are you lost? Do you need help?" Lyla nodded, then shook her head, then finally choked out. "My grandma, she's not breathing right. She fell. I tried." Sam was already moving, reaching for her phone. But before she could finish dialing, a voice cut across the street like a knife through wet cloth. "Don't get involved." It was Ellis, standing on his porch, arms crossed, lips curled. Her mama was trash. That family's cursed. I wouldn't bring that kind of mess into your house if I were you. Sam froze, phone in hand, turned to look at Lyla, then back at Ellis. "That child just told us her grandmother's unconscious." Ellis spat. "Let the state handle it. You think you're saving a puppy? You're inviting rot," Eric muttered. "Jesus." Another porch light flicked on, then another. A curtain moved. No one stepped out. But the air was watching. Sam hesitated, thumb still hovering over the screen. Lyla stepped back. She recognized the shift. She knew when a door wasn't going to open, even the good ones. She didn't blame them. Not really. It just made the air thinner. She turned and walked. Sam called after her, "Wait," but Lyla didn't wait, didn't turn. She walked to the edge of the cul-de-sac, past the last fence, past the first patch of real desert, past safety, past care. The wind tugged at her hair. The sky was fire now, lit from below. She stopped under a dead Joshua tree, pulled a cracked plastic bottle from her pocket. The water inside sloshed like hope on its last legs. She drank half, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, tied the hoodie tighter around her waist, then stepped into the sand, into the open, into the beyond. She didn't know how far she'd go, didn't know what she was looking for anymore, but she had to go, because no one else would, because the world had told her something tonight. Not in words, but in silences, in locks, in narrowed eyes. She was alone, completely, and that meant there were no more rules, no more knocking, no more asking, only walking, only wind, only the red skin of the desert opening before her like a wound that said, "Come," and she did. She came, carrying nothing but a bottle, a name, and a love so fierce it burned through her chest. Alma. The name throbbed inside her like a second heart. Alma. Still lying there, still breathing, maybe. Alma, who told her not to believe in fire horses. Alma, who taught her how to hear the wind. And now, the wind was screaming, and she was the only one listening. The desert took her in like a secret. Lyla didn't remember falling. One moment she was walking, staggering more than walking, feet dragging half buried in the hot, fine sand. The next weightless. The sky above her was bleeding into itself, a bruised violet smeared over a searing gold. The heat shimmered like glass over the dunes, twisting shapes that weren't there into monsters that might have been. Her knees buckled first, then her hands, then her breath. Her bottle rolled from her fingers, empty. The sand caught her like it had been waiting. Fine. Burning grains clung to her lashes, filled her shoes, kissed the corners of her mouth. Her head tilted sideways, her cheek pressed against the earth, and for a strange, still second, she thought she heard it breathing. Deep, slow, ancient. Then everything turned to static. The colors bled. The edges of the world curled like paper on fire, and all she had left was the sound of her own heartbeat. Dull, faint, slowing, thud. Thud. She didn't dream. There were no visions of Alma, No flickers of comfort or memory, just heat, a deep, pressing warmth that had no hands and no name. It wrapped around her chest, not squeezing, just holding. And then a vibration, not sound, movement. The ground pulsed under her face, faint at first, then louder, closer, like a drum made of dust and thunder. Each beat timed with her breath, like someone or something was syncing with her. She opened her eyes, or thought she did. Everything was red. The air, the sand, the sky. The world had turned the color of blood and sun, and through that red mist came motion. Not a blur, not a hallucination. It was too precise for that, too real. It stepped into her dying world without apology. A horse, but not like any she'd ever seen. It was massive, sleek, impossibly fluid in the way it moved. Its coat shimmered amber and rust, gold and coal. Not like paint, not like fur. More like the desert itself had condensed into muscle and breath and bone. Its eyes glowed not with light, but with something older. Fire trapped in glass. Rage and kindness braided into one impossible stare. It said nothing, made no sound. Even its hooves whispered, barely disturbing the sand. But she felt it, not just in her body, in her memory, as if she'd known it before, as if she'd always known it. The fire horse, real, alive. And here, it didn't sniff her, didn't rear or snort or act like the horses she'd watched behind Ellis's metal fences. It simply stood over her, casting a long, molten shadow, like it had been carved from the sunset itself. And then, without invitation, without command, it knelt. One knee in the sand, front legs folding like silk beneath its chest, the creature brought its head low, eyes locking with hers, the kind of look no human had ever given her. Not Alma, not her mother, not the neighbors, not even Sam. It was a question and an answer at once. Lyla didn't speak, couldn't. Her lips were cracked, her throat was sandpaper, but she didn't need words. She moved instead. One hand, tiny, shaking, caked in dirt, reached forward. She touched its neck, and fire didn't burn her. It hummed. The warmth that met her hand wasn't heat, it was presence. It was memory. The horse's skin was velvet stretched over the thrum of something infinite, a pulse older than electricity, older than language. The horse stood again, slow, strong. Then, with a grace that bordered on sacred, it lowered itself just enough to let her crawl onto its back. No reins, no saddle, no weight. She didn't think, didn't question. She simply moved. Her legs clung to its sides, her arms wrapped around its neck, her cheek pressed into its mane, which smelled of sun and storm and something unnameable. And then they moved. Not galloped, not fled, moved. Together, like one organism made of girl and beast and silence. The world slipped beneath them like a ribbon. The dunes blurred, the rocks passed like sighs, the wind bowed around them. Even the sun, once so cruel now, seemed to dim its fury, as if in reverence. No cars, no roads, no signs, just direction, just instinct, just a thread pulled by something divine. Time twisted. She didn't know if they rode for minutes or hours. She couldn't tell if the sky changed or if her eyes simply forgot how to see. All she knew was this: she was safe. Not because someone said she was, not because she had shelter or food or a map, but because the thing beneath her, this fire horse, this living myth, was truth. The kind of truth the wind had tried to tell her about all along. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't need to, because wherever it was better than where she'd been, better than locked doors and whispered names, better than Sandra's sharp words and Ellis's poison eyes, better than the silence of every neighbor who looked out and chose not to open up. Here, in the saddle of a creature that didn't speak, didn't demand, didn't judge, Lyla remembered what it meant to belong, not to a town, not to a bloodline, but to the world, to the dust and the stars and the heartbeat of things that cannot lie. At one point, she opened her eyes again. They were near a ridge-red rock to one side, a narrow trail winding downward. She felt the shift in the horse's shoulders as it navigated the terrain without hesitation. Then, far ahead, like a dot in the canvas of dusk, something man-made. A low building, a red cross, lights, a human place. The horse slowed, breathed deep. Its breath fogged the air around her like smoke from an invisible fire. As they reached the building, a small rescue station half buried in wind and time, the fire horse came to a stop. Still no sound. Still no command. It turned its head just enough to look at her, not to say goodbye. Not yet. Just to mark the moment. Then it knelt again, and Lyla slid off. Her knees nearly buckled, but the sand caught her. She turned to thank it, to say something, anything, but it was already gone. No blur, no gust. Just absence, as if it had never been. Only her hand still burned softly where she had touched its neck. Not pain, just warmth. Residual awe. Inside the building, someone screamed when they saw her. A medic ran out, scooped her up. She didn't hear the questions, didn't see the flashing lights, didn't process the chaos. She only whispered one word before she fell asleep in the woman's arms. Fire. They thought she meant the heat. They thought she meant the desert, but they were wrong. She meant the truth, the kind that rides without sound, the kind that touches without taking, the kind that burns only what is false. The ride didn't stop, not for wind, not for thirst, not even for the world trying to fold itself shut around them. The fire horse moved like it had no muscles, only memory like it wasn't galloping but returning. Its legs didn't pound the earth, they slipped through it. The landscape changed in pieces. A cracked salt flat that shimmered like a lake of ghosts. A field of wind-beaten mesquite twisted into fists. A low ridge of stone where the moonlight bled against ironwood shadows. Lyla lay curled against its neck, asleep but not lost. One arm hung limply, hand twitching slightly with each shift of the horse's stride. Her dreams weren't dreams anymore. They were voices, Alma's voice, curling like smoke around her consciousness. Not words, but fragments, echoes. They say the fire horse only appears when you're not looking. Cut to a memory. Lyla, younger, sitting in Alma's lap, staring into the fireplace that barely coughed heat. Alma whispered stories between coughs, her breath thick with years. Used to be, folks feared the desert more than hell. But there were stories. Stories of a creature that didn't burn you. It reminded you what mattered. No saddle, no master, no name. Just shows up when everything else disappears. Lyla blinked slowly, fingers buried in the hem of Alma's cardigan. Did it ever come to you? Alma smiled without showing teeth. Once, maybe. Or maybe I just needed to believe it did. The voice blurred. The world returned. Real. Present. The fire horse crested a dune, slowed for the first time, then pivoted sharply down a slope of sun-baked rock. The town shimmered in the far-off dark, just a few buildings. A blinking red light, the harsh hum of a generator that never really slept. Lyla stirred. The wind caught strands of her hair and blew them gently across her cheek. She didn't open her eyes, but her hand moved barely, gripping a handful of mane like it was the only truth she had. The horse continued, through a narrow pass lined with Joshua trees that reached like fingers, past a barbed wire fence half buried in sand, down a barely there trail that most men wouldn't see even in daylight. Finally, light. A rescue outpost. A squat concrete building with a rusted steel ramp and a faded red cross glowing above the door. The fire horse stopped, not abruptly, softly, decisively. It stood in the dark like a shadow of fire. Then, slowly, almost reverently, it knelt. Lyla slid from its back like a whisper. She landed on her knees, blinking up at the floodlights. A shape emerged from the door, a woman in scrubs, mid-30s, clutching a clipboard and a cup of coffee. She dropped both when she saw the child. Jesus Christ. Her voice cracked into the radio at her hip. We've got a child, unresponsive but breathing. Dispatch paramedics now. I need a gurney. She reached Lyla in seconds, scooped her up, and turned back. She didn't see what followed, but the security camera did. A high-angle shot, grainy, black and white, the fire horse, standing behind the child, waiting, still, its head slightly bowed. Then after exactly 14 seconds, it turned and disappeared into the dark. Not galloping, not bolting, just gone. The nurse inside tried to make sense of the child's vitals, but Lyla wouldn't wake. When the EMTs arrived, she stirred faintly, whispered something. Amber. They thought she was saying her name. They didn't understand. And if you one of the splode into the Janarodas of ghosts, and they one of the ballad into the fane. The next morning, Dr. Samantha Breyer sat in her living room, coffee going cold, eyes fixed on a paused frame of grainy footage. There, that thing, the impossible shape. She'd seen 1,000 horse silhouettes in textbooks and vet manuals and anatomy scans. But this wasn't any of those. It wasn't right. Too smooth, too still, too aware. She hit play again. 14 seconds. The horse didn't flinch at the floodlight, didn't shift weight, didn't even blink, then gone. She watched it 3 times before Eric came into the room. You've been up all night? I need you to look at this. He peered over her shoulder, still rubbing sleep from his eyes. Is that real? It's security footage from the rescue outpost, just north of the ridge. You remember that little girl we saw the other night? Lyla? He nodded slowly. The one the neighbors didn't want us talking to. She was found outside the building. Alone. Passed out. This horse brought her there. Eric stared, then squinted. Could be faked. CGI. You know how these fringe sites work. This isn't from a fringe site, Sam snapped. It's a raw export. They called me because I was the only local with both medical and equine background. Eric didn't answer. Sam turned to him, eyes flaring. She was 37 miles from her home, Eric. No shoes, no injuries on her feet, no dehydration trauma. She was carried. This thing carried her. He rubbed the back of his neck. So, what do you want to do? Sam didn't answer right away. She looked back at the screen, at the girl in the frame, at the blur of myth and muscle behind her. Then, quietly, I want to meet her again. In the Niderd, in Willa for me. Hospital room 2B was quiet, except for the steady beep of the monitor and the low hum of the IV pump. Lyla was awake, but barely. Her eyes were open, fixed on something far beyond the ceiling tiles. Sam sat beside her bed. She didn't speak for a while, just watched her. Watched the way Lyla breathed, not like a child in pain, but like someone who'd seen something she didn't know how to explain. Do you remember me? Sam asked eventually. A slow blink. Then, a tiny nod. I saw you the other night. You were trying to get help. I should have said something. I should have stopped you. Lyla didn't respond. Her fingers played silently with the edge of the blanket. I saw the video, Sam whispered. Of the horse. Lyla looked at her then. Really looked. It was the first moment of recognition. Sam leaned in. Do you know what it was? Lyla opened her mouth, then closed it. Instead, she raised one hand, placed it over her chest, held it there. Sam mirrored the gesture without knowing why. Ask. In played Razor and BS. They discharged Lyla into emergency foster care that evening, but there were no takers. No one in town wanted her. No relatives came forward. The sheriff's department offered to drive her to the state facility, 4 hours south. Sam said no. I'll take her. Just temporarily. She didn't ask Eric. He didn't fight her. They made up the guest room, bought kid-size clothes at a Walmart 20 miles away. Lyla didn't say much, didn't cry, didn't ask for Alma. She just sat at the window, watching the desert, like it owed her something, like it had promised it would return. That night, after Lyla had gone to bed, Sam sat alone on the porch. The wind carried dust across the deck. The stars burned too bright. Eric came out, handed her a glass of wine. You believe it, don't you? She didn't answer. He sat beside her, sipped his own. Finally, he said, It doesn't make sense. I know. But it's real. I know. Eric looked out toward the dunes. Then what do we do? Sam's voice was soft. We wait. Alma didn't die. But something in her did. The stroke clawed into her like an invisible thief, stealing half her body and nearly all her speech. When she opened her eyes in the hospital, they were clouded with something Lyla had never seen in them before: fear. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that cries out. The quieter kind. The kind that hides under skin and behind stubborn silence. The kind that knows it's been left behind. Alma could blink, move 2 fingers on her right hand. The left side of her body hung limp, her face slack in places that once brimmed with fire. She tried to say Lyla's name once, and it came out like breath dragging across a splinter. Sam was there when the doctor delivered the diagnosis. We'll need to transfer her to a long-term facility, he said, tone clinical. There's no caregiver at home, no one qualified. Lyla stood just outside the doorway, invisible by accident and habit. She heard every word. Later that night, in Sam's house, Lyla whispered, I want to go home. Sam, caught off guard, looked up from the laundry pile she was folding. Sweetheart, your grandma's getting help now. That house isn't safe for you. No one's there. Lyla didn't blink, didn't look away. Sam swallowed. It's better you stay here, just for now. But Lyla didn't answer. She simply turned her face toward the window. Outside, the desert was starting to change again. The wind picked up, sharp and granular, whispering something that only Lyla seemed to hear. Thanks for watching. Then making for Minish. That was a power and a rapper. The house was sealed the next morning. A county official posted the notice on the door. Uninhabitable until further notice. The windows were boarded. The porch sagged heavier than before. Dust had settled over the roof like a shroud. Inside, Alma's teacup still sat on the counter, lipstick faded, water now a chalky ring. No one else came. No neighbors. No family. Not even the wind lingered long. But that night, something did. At 2:17 a.m., a motion-triggered security camera mounted on a telephone pole near the north edge of town activated. The footage was black and white, grainy, but it was clear: the fire horse, standing motionless outside the boarded window of the house. It didn't approach, didn't scrape the ground, or try to break in. It just stood there, its head slightly bowed, like in prayer, its eyes fixed on the dark, behind the glass. It remained there for 6 hours and 17 minutes. It never left the frame. The light changed behind it, night giving way to dawn, stars vanishing one by one, but it never moved, not even once. Then, as the first hint of orange touched the hills, the figure turned, took 3 steps back, and vanished into the wind. An animat of Tamley. There, the video hit the local forum first. An off-duty lineman pulled the file during routine equipment checks, out of curiosity. He almost deleted it, another false motion ping, but paused just long enough to see the silhouette. He watched it once, twice, then uploaded it. Within hours, it was everywhere. Reddit, TikTok. A viral tweet with 1.2 million likes. Who stands still for 6 hours outside a window? A ghost? An angel? A horse made of fire? Comment sections ignited. CGI. Hoax. Art installation. Marketing stunt for a film? No, look at the sand. Look at the way the wind moves around it. This thing's real. News outlets picked it up. First local, then regional. One headline read, "Fire horse appears in desert, signs of the supernatural, or just desperation." But in the town, nothing. People didn't talk about it, at least not openly. They whispered in gas stations and bakeries, always behind someone's back. It's just those damn people again. Always drama, always something to cry about. They're probably faking it. Maybe the girl trained that horse. You know, her mom was into weird stuff. One woman at the church told another, "Trouble follows blood. It always has. Look at the family line. The doors that hadn't opened for Lyla when Alma fell, still closed. Only now, they locked them twice, just in case. And when the state of Con 64, and with Mob and Ma Potter, and when the Potter suspected bearing and masquerade, and with an idle round." Back in Sam's house, Lyla watched the video in silence. Someone had shown it to her at the clinic. A nurse who didn't know the story, only the myth. "That's the thing you said saved you, isn't it?" Lyla nodded once. That night, Sam sat across from her, phone still warm in her hand after watching the clip for the 10th time. She didn't speak for a while, didn't ask Lyla what she thought. She just watched the child's face, expressionless, unmoving, but not empty. There was something building in her, quiet, heavy, like smoke before it becomes flame. "Finally," Sam said, "he came back for you." Lyla's eyes shifted. Sam leaned forward. "He stood there all night, didn't make a sound, just waited. Do you know why?" Lyla opened her mouth, closed it again. Then she placed her hand on the table, flat, still, then lifted one finger, tapped once, right over her heart. Sam stared. "I don't understand," she said, more to herself than anyone else. But Lyla didn't repeat it, didn't explain, didn't have to. "People NES, as there will Reddit, answer darg, a passable." Later that night, Sam found herself unable to sleep. Eric was out cold beside her, breathing slow, but she couldn't turn her brain off. She sat in the living room, staring at the freeze frame, the horse, the house, the angle of the body, the stillness. It wasn't just presence, it was patience, loyalty, grief. No animal behaved like that. No wild horse, no domestic one either. She'd spent enough of her life studying them, treating them, trying to understand them. But this was different. It wasn't science. It wasn't story. It was something else. Something inconvenient. She poured herself a drink. Didn't finish it. Spent the next hour watching people online try to debunk it. Most failed. The best they could do was mock the emotion people were projecting onto it. "It's just standing there," one guy wrote. "Why is that noble?" Sam shut the laptop. Because standing there meant everything, she thought. Because showing up without reward, without need, that was the rarest thing a living being could do. From the choired, in the rettering, pated bonner, in the rettering, in leading that wados in failing mattering. The next day, Sam drove past the old house. The boards were still up, the door still padlocked, but something had changed. She pulled over, got out, stood on the dirt shoulder for a long time, looking at the window, then walked closer. The wind stirred her coat. Her boots crunched in the gravel. There, on the ground, in the fine dust below the window, hoofprints, not recent, but not gone either. She crouched, fingers brushing one, still there, still shaped, still waiting to be understood. "And have the graft of fallowage, and taken and served it in schemes of the common weighted other one of the face." Back home, Lyla sat at the window again. But this time, she wasn't waiting. She was remembering. And when Sam stepped inside, gently holding a cup of warm milk, she saw something had shifted in the girl's posture. Not her body, her spirit. There was something steadier now, like the silence inside her had roots. One of Corzin, and fresh. "I have. One of Corzin, way. I have. I have. I have. I have. I have. I have." That night, Sam lay awake again. But this time, it wasn't from disbelief. It was something worse. Faith, uninvited, uncomfortable, unexplained. Something inside her had started to shift, and she didn't know how to stop it, or if she even wanted to. Because whether it was real or not, the horse had returned, and she had seen what no one else had. The way Lyla placed her hand over her heart, as if to say, "Some love doesn't knock. It just stands outside until it's let in." Lyla didn't speak much in the weeks that followed, but she did draw, always horses, At first, Sam thought it was just a phase. Trauma doing what it does, fixating, recycling the one event that gave it shape. But these weren't ordinary sketches. There was something unnervingly consistent about them. The same horse, again and again. Same body, same stance. Never running, never rearing. Always still, always looking back. Sam found them everywhere. On napkins, grocery lists, the back of receipts. One day, she discovered 3 torn pages from her medical journal taped to Lyla's window, each with a piece of the horse drawn in charcoal. When you stood back, it came together like a puzzle. The fire horse, etched in silence, watching the desert. But what unsettled Sam the most was where Lyla started drawing next. The door frame, the wooden edge of the back porch, the glass panel near the kitchen, tiny hoofprints scratched into corners of the house, as if she were tracing its return, not imagining it. Eric noticed too. He asked Sam one morning, coffee in hand, "Is this normal?" Sam didn't answer right away. Normal for grief, or for a child who was carried 40 miles by a myth? Eric gave her a look. Sam exhaled. "I don't know what's normal anymore." In the excerpt of the 2027 and weekend starting and one of the 2020, Lyla had a new habit. She'd sit by the window after dinner, face turned west, elbows on the sill, waiting. Not with hope, exactly. Not like a child waiting for a parent who promised they'd return, more like a sentinel, like someone who owed the horizon her attention. Sam watched her from the kitchen. Some nights she asked questions, not to pry, just to connect. "Do you want to draw something else? Want to help me bake? Want to tell me what it felt like riding him?" But Lyla never answered. She didn't ignore. She just listened to something inside her, something that didn't speak in words. "If you want a daj, I was met a raster. If you want a daj in around her." One night, Sam sat across from her, both of them in silence, their reflections bleeding into the window pane. Outside, the desert breathed like a sleeping animal. Wind swept the sand, but the sky was clear. Sam finally asked, "Why do you think he came back?" Lyla didn't blink. She didn't look away. She just lifted one hand and laid it flat against her chest. A single pat, then back down. Sam swallowed. Her throat felt tight. "You mean your heart?" Lyla nodded. "Just once, that was all. And somehow, it was enough. And in not one. And litter in 10 rower." That night, Sam couldn't sleep. Again. She tossed, turned, got up, wandered the hallway like a ghost in socks. Past Lyla's door, peered in. The girl was asleep, curled toward the wall, hand tucked under her cheek. The blankets kicked off again. Sam pulled them over her gently. She paused at the doorway, watched, listened, then left. But instead of going back to bed, she grabbed her keys and drove. Once of the green and rather, that once of the cruise. The desert didn't care that it was nearly midnight. It didn't care about headlights or tire tracks or human timelines. It was the same as always. Indifferent, eternal. Sam parked where the gravel gave way to sand, killed the engine, stepped out. The air hit her like a warning, cold, dry, insistent. The moon was out, barely. A dull blade behind clouds. She walked, not sure where, not sure why. Each step felt more and more detached from her body. Shoes crunching over broken rock and packed dirt. The wind slapped her face, stung her eyes, pulled at her jacket like a taunt. She pressed on. Eventually, she reached the top of a small dune, where the sand curled into itself like waves. She paused, closed her eyes, stood still, let the wind talk. At first, nothing. Then, movement. Behind her, number. Ahead, far, but real. She opened her eyes, and saw them. Not eyes, not a shape, just impressions. A trail of hoofprints, pressed deep into the sand, as if made just hours ago. They led to the ridge, curved like a question. Sam stepped closer. Kneeling, she placed her hand over one. The depression was sharp, still crisp. The sand hadn't yet erased it. She stared at her palm, then at the ridge. Something flickered. She jerked upright. There, just past the slope, a pulse of amber. Not fire, not flame, just light, alive and flickering. It vanished. She stood frozen, heart loud in her ears. Another flicker, further away this time. Gone again. No sound, no hoofbeats, only the wind. And that impossible color, softer than torchlight, older than the sun. Thanks for watching and Mosen that option. Ago every an option. Back home, Sam didn't tell Eric. Didn't mention the prints, the light, the way the air had changed. But Lyla knew. At breakfast, the girl looked at her once, just once, and in that look, Sam saw the truth. She'd been seen, not by the horse, by the belief. And once you saw it, it didn't let go. In the waters thing and that happened. That was the face. Over the next few days, Sam stopped trying to disprove it. She stopped trying to find the line between reality and story. It wasn't a line, it was a loop. One, she was now inside. She bought a notebook, began recording everything Lyla said. The drawings, the dreams, the gestures. But Lyla never elaborated, never explained, because explanation would have ruined it. The silence was the story. The mystery was the map. In mortal courting, one afternoon, Sam found a series of charcoal marks on the back patio. They weren't just drawings this time. They were symbols, circles, lines, shapes that mimicked the motion of hooves, but also seemed to mimic language. She took photos, went online, searched indigenous symbols, old cowboy codes, animal trail signs. Nothing matched. That night, Lyla caught her staring at them. Sam asked quietly, "What does it mean?" Lyla shrugged. Then, for the first time in days, she spoke. Her voice was a rasp, small, but whole. "It's not for reading." Sam blinked. "Then, what's it for?" Lyla looked past her, out toward the desert, for remembering. And the coming for the brace. The coming in radiate. Sam stood at the sink that evening, washing dishes with shaking hands. She didn't know why they trembled. Not fear, not cold. Something else. A tectonic shift beneath her belief system. She didn't hear Lyla enter the kitchen, didn't know she was there until a napkin appeared beside her, folded. On it a new drawing. The fire horse. But this time, there was something new. It wasn't standing alone. Next to it, very small, very faint, was a human figure, kneeling, facing the horse, and between them, a single flame, drawn in red crayon. Sam picked it up, felt something hitch in her breath. "What's the flame mean?" Lyla didn't answer. She just placed her hand on her chest again, and walked away. "That most it is a post of the Mation. That most it is a post of the most about this monet." Sam stared at the napkin long after the water had turned cold. It burned in her hand, not literally, but deeply, like it had rewired something. A quiet promise, unspoken, that maybe she was no longer just watching Lyla's story. Maybe she was in it. And maybe that story wasn't about survival, or proof. Maybe it was about presence. Thank you for watching, and you get a daze. That night, Sam returned to the dune, alone. No flashlight, no camera, just herself. She stood still for a long time. Wind clawed at her face. Sand stung her eyes. But she didn't turn away, didn't blink. She waited. And for a moment, just one, she swore she saw it again. A flicker, not a ghost, not a god, just something ancient. Something waiting. Something that didn't need to be believed to be true. Only seen, only welcomed. She whispered, "I'm here." No one answered. But the silence this time felt full, like the beginning of language, not the end of it. The nursing home smelled like lemon disinfectant and folded endings. The hallways were quiet, not from peace, but from resignation. The kind of silence you can only hear after enough goodbyes have settled into the wallpaper. Sam walked beside Lyla slowly, not saying anything, not holding her hand. She knew by now that Lyla didn't want to be guided, just accompanied. There was a difference. In her small hands, Lyla carried a folded piece of paper, creased from being opened and closed too many times. She didn't clutch it. She just held it gently, like it knew how to carry its own weight. Alma's room was at the end of the west wing, room 18B. A window with no view, just the side of another building. A dead spider in the corner of the frame. The door was open. Alma sat slumped in her wheelchair, facing the wall. Her hair had thinned. Her skin was parchment. One side of her mouth sagged slightly from the stroke, but her eyes, they were still there, still fierce, still alive. She didn't turn when they entered. Not right away. Sam stood by the door, unsure if she was welcome. But Lyla didn't hesitate. She stepped in, unfolded the paper, and placed it on Alma's lap. It was a drawing of the fire horse, drawn in the same quiet precision as all the others, but this one was different. The background was filled in dark blues and soft yellows, representing night, starlight, silence. The horse stood beside a window, Alma's window, looking in. Alma's eyes shifted down, took it in. Her good hand trembled slightly. Her fingers brushed the edge of the paper, and for a long time, nothing moved. Then her shoulders began to shake, not violently, not with sound, just a slow, deep cracking tremor. Lyla stepped closer, kneeling, and Alma, who hadn't made a full sentence in weeks, spoke, voice gravel dragged across memory. "They always told me, horses were meant to be ridden, tamed, used." Lyla didn't respond. Alma continued, halting, but sharper now. "But we never taught people how to love them, just taught horses how to suffer us." A silence fell that wasn't empty. It was a reckoning, a confession to something larger than either of them. Alma reached for Lyla's hand with hers, the good one, and held it. Weakly, shakily, but wholly. Sam turned away, blinking fast. and that is the same to it pribes that may down of than a pribes of Belty for. That night, Sam sat at the kitchen table, laptop open, wine untouched. The video of the fire horse still standing outside Alma's old house, head bowed, played on repeat. The file had been passed around 100 times now, edited, memed, misinterpreted, used, but no one had done what Sam was about to do, broadcast it. She emailed it to the local news affiliate, attached a short message. This is real. It saved a child. It stood vigil over her grandmother. If this doesn't matter to people, then maybe nothing does. Eric came in just as she hit send. You're really doing it. She didn't turn. Yes. You know what the town will say. I know. They'll say we're attention seekers, that it's staged. I don't care. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. Why now? Sam turned in her chair. If a horse can show up in the middle of the night, stand outside a broken woman's window, and ask for nothing, then what excuse do we have? Eric said nothing, because there was nothing to say. And when the cinema warned his reckless, that was back. The story aired 2 nights later. Late evening segment. No hype, no teaser. Just a quiet 5-minute package introduced by a tired anchor in a tan suit. The footage played. The fire horse, the house, the stillness, the impossible grace. The anchor's voiceover was restrained but reverent, captured on a municipal camera near the edge of town. Officials confirm no tampering. No local ranchers report a missing horse of this description. Then Sam's interview. Just 30 seconds. Grainy webcam. Tired eyes. Conviction like iron. This isn't about proving anything. It's about witnessing something pure. People closed their doors to this little girl. But that animal didn't juck. That means something. Or at least it should. The segment ended. No fireworks. No debate panel. Just the image of the horse, still staring through the glass as the credits rolled. And with me Ford is Adam and Shane. And with me 454, and that resulting meaning and other incident. By morning, it had been shared 200,000 times. By noon, 1 million. By dusk, 3. Teachers in Oregon were showing it in classrooms. A school counselor in Colorado posted a video of students drawing the fire horse in art class. But the most unexpected response came from right down the street. The elementary school Lyla should have been attending. She hadn't gone back since the incident. Sam hadn't forced her. The wounds were still fresh, the whispers still loud. But now the principal called. Not to scold, to invite. We'd like to do something. For Lyla. Sam hesitated. Like what? You'll see. Just bring her by. Tomorrow morning. Please. And one of this area, and like the frame this split. Lyla didn't want to go at first. She stood in the hallway, hair unbrushed, expression flat. Sam crouched beside her. You don't have to talk, or stay, or smile. But I think you should see. Lyla didn't answer. But an hour later, she was in the passenger seat. As many, and four, and with face, and one of this world and Bill. They walked through the school's side entrance. No reporters. No cameras. Just a handful of faculty waiting. The art teacher, a woman named Carol, led them to the multi-purpose room. Inside, Lyla stopped. Her breath caught. The walls were covered, floor to ceiling, drawings, paintings, crayon sketches, hundreds of them, all of the fire horse, some crude, some breathtaking, but all the same figure, the amber body, the steady stance, the silent watch. Children's handwriting filled the captions. He stood by her house all night. He didn't even need to talk. Maybe he's not real, but maybe love doesn't need to be. This horse is braver than grown-ups. I would open my door if he came. He didn't give up. In the center of the room stood a sculpture. Wire, papier-mâché, aluminum foil, kid-made, shimmering in the sunlight from the skylight. The fire horse. Lyla stared at it, and then, for the first time in what felt like forever, she smiled. Not a grin, not polite, a real smile. Wide, wild, unfiltered joy. Sam saw it. Felt it like a sunbeam straight to the chest. A teacher stepped forward. We're making this an annual thing. The day of the fire horse. Not a holiday, just a reminder. To watch, to wait, to show up. Although, Lyla reached out and touched the sculpture's flank. The material crinkled beneath her fingers. And in that moment, she didn't look like a survivor. She looked like a spark, like something reborn. We have now an ideal. In 20 describes for Grotus. Later that night, Sam sat on the porch. The wind picked up. Not harsh, just present. She looked out toward the desert, where the horizon blurred into gold, and she whispered, "Thank you." Not to the horse, not to the myth, but to the truth of it all, the shape of love. Not loud, not demanding, just standing there, waiting to be seen. The man arrived without warning. His boots were dusty, soles worn flat from years of walking without permission. He stood on Sam's porch like someone who had once known how to knock but had long since forgotten the point. Hat low, shirt frayed, a leather satchel slung over one shoulder. Sam opened the door halfway, one hand on the frame. She squinted into the sunlight. "Can I help you?" He nodded, once, then spoke. "I'm here for the girl." Her instincts flared. She stepped forward, subtle but firm. "Why?" He didn't flinch, his eyes pale gray. Storm-hollowed met hers with the kind of honesty that wasn't performative. It was old, tired, and real. "I saw it. The horse." Sam froze. He continued, voice steady. "Not last month, not even this year. 40 winters back. My name's Redmond. I think your girl and I might be the only ones who've ever looked at it long enough to remember it." She didn't answer. She didn't trust him yet. But something about his voice graveled by regret, not time, cut through her resistance. Lyla stepped beside her. Not behind. Beside. She looked up at him, eyes unreadable. Redmond saw her, really saw her, and nodded again. "I used to ride," he said. "Used to believe too." Lyla said nothing, but she opened the door wider. "Thanks for watching. In a man as that menorited ensures. A lot of what?" The fire pit crackled, low and slow, behind Sam's house. Twilight curled around them in ribbons. The desert was unusually quiet, like it too had paused to listen. Redmond sat across from Lyla, knees wide, hands knotted together, his hat on the ground beside him. He didn't launch into a story. He unfolded it, like a letter that had waited too long to be read. "I was 17. My brother, Ben, was 9. We got caught in a whiteout. Snow, wind, cold that ripped through bone and pride alike. We were 3 miles from camp. I told him we'd make it. I lied." He didn't pause for effect, just took a breath, like pulling it from somewhere deep. "Our horse had bucked earlier that day, broke its front left, couldn't carry us both. I stayed with Ben, hoped someone would find us." Lyla sat cross-legged, still as a prayer. "I must have passed out. But when I came to, Ben was gone. So was the wind, so was the storm." He leaned forward slightly, and there it was, standing 10 feet from me. Big, amber, fire where a heart should be. His voice dropped. It had no reins, no saddle, just eyes that knew things they shouldn't. Sam watched from the back steps, arms folded, unmoving. "I found Ben curled beneath a cottonwood 3 miles east, still breathing. No tracks, no prints. But I knew." A looked straight into Lila's eyes. "I knew what had carried him." Lyla blinked once, then pulled something from her pocket, a crumpled drawing, half faded from being handled too often. The fire horse, standing beneath a night sky, no stars, just silence. She handed it to him. He held it like it might shatter, then nodded. "So, it still chooses?" Lyla asked. "Why you?" Redmond's eyes shifted to the fire. "Maybe because I needed to know magic was real. Or maybe because I needed reminding that not all wild things run away." He rubbed the back of his neck, voice tightening. "I used to train horses. Ranch work, obedience, precision. Taught 'em how to ignore their instincts so a man could call it loyalty." He stared at the flames, and something inside him flickered. "There was one I loved, not just road loved. Called her Junebug, chestnut, sharp-eyed. She had too much heart and too little fear." He swallowed. "The boss said she was too wild to sell, that I should break her hard. I did what I was told." A silence opened. Heavy, raw. She panicked, ran blind, fell into a ravine. He didn't cry, but his mouth trembled. "She didn't die because she was wild. She died because I stopped being." Lyla didn't look away, didn't judge. She just listened. And in that moment, Redmond understood why the horse had chosen her. In my cordit, and cordit, that it markle. He reached into his satchel, pulled out a small, polished piece of obsidian wrapped in leather. "This is from the place I buried her." He handed it to Lyla. She cradled it, stared into the black glass. "There's a piece of every fire that doesn't burn," he said. "That just waits to be remembered." The fire cracked behind him. He smiled, barely. "Some fires are for warmth, not war." They sat in silence. The kind that isn't empty. The kind that fills you, like breath. "And the lodge now end as I be. That be. Lyla finally spoke. "Can I see it again?" Redmond looked toward the hills, where the sun was almost gone and the sky had turned the color of forgiveness. He didn't answer, just tilted his head toward the ridgeline, then nodded once. That was all, and somehow it was enough. Thanks a portion. Later that night, Sam sat beside Eric in bed, her head against his shoulder. "He knew," she whispered. "Knew what?" "That it was real." Eric didn't say anything, but he placed his hand over hers and left it there. The men inexperiently of lowered of the past of the componentation. Out back, the fire still glowed in the pit. Lyla stood beside it, the obsidian stone clutched in her fist. She looked toward the hills. The wind stirred, the stars blinked, and somewhere, far beyond the reach of language, something watched back, waiting, but never rushing, just being. The birthday was Sam's idea. Nothing grand, no clowns, no plastic hats, just something small, something kind. She baked the cake herself, vanilla, with cinnamon frosting, the way Lyla once said Alma used to make it. There were no balloons, just a few streamers taped awkwardly along the fence, fluttering in the wind like half-remembered promises. 4 neighborhood kids showed up. None of them knew Lyla well, but their parents did. The story had gotten around. The fire horse had made believers out of cynics, or at least softened their silence. Sam greeted each child warmly, her hands dusted with flour, her eyes darting to the window more than once. Lyla wasn't there. She was out back, on the hill, again. Whiling, she had risen early, before the frosting set, before the day could announce itself as hers. The morning air was cool, touched by autumn's breath. She slipped on her boots, the ones Eric bought her with the soft soles and faded red laces, and walked past the line of sagebrush until the grass gave way to wind-shaped sand. The house behind her shrank, folded into the earth like it had never been. She walked slowly, deliberately. This was not a search. This was a return. And it not be at place. Be at her esteen. At the top of the hill, the sky opened wide. It was a color she didn't know how to name, somewhere between memory and waiting. And there, just beyond the ridge, framed by golden dust, he stood, still, as if he had always been there, as if he had never left. Afters people an essential in happening condition. The fire horse, amber and ash, flame and stillness, unmoving, unblinking, watching her, from just beyond the reach of invitation. For Maddle, subscribe, that loge. Lyla didn't run. She didn't wave. She didn't cry. She just stood where she was, and raised her hand, not high, just to her chest. Left side, flat palm, that was all. This one, and the news. The wind caught her dress, lifting it just slightly, like a breath from the earth. Her hair tangled around her face, and for a moment she closed her eyes not to shut the horse out, but to feel him better. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was alive, like a bridge made of knowing. And with a maid from White Thous and a stupid other card. And weather leveler. Down below, the children laughed around the cake. Sam looked up from lighting the candles and noticed Lyla's absence. She didn't panic. She knew. She set the cake down, wiped her hands on her jeans, and walked to the edge of the yard. She could see the ridge from here. Couldn't see Lyla, but she felt her. Felt something holy, or close enough. There is no today. There are stated back about from marks. On the hill, Lyla stepped forward. 1 pace. The horse didn't move, didn't flinch, but something in the air tightened, like strings being drawn across a cello's belly. Another step. Still. Then, Lyla stopped. That was enough. Cederate, I'm Lowe's. 1 back. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the world wasn't vast. It was intimate, reduced to 2 hearts and the wind between them. Thanks for watching, and for my laughter. She remembered Alma's words once. Some fire doesn't burn, some just stays, to warm, to hold, to witness. This was that fire, the kind that doesn't need to consume to prove it exists, the kind that stands still, that waits, that returns. As it in of then is rack, that's 5. In nextimation is now, and fernigrate, that's 5 to self. A tumbleweed rolled between them, casting no shadow. A hawk cried high overhead, but neither flinched. They were locked in something older than sound. In the roof 4. And folded in waiter. That stid at it. Then, slowly, Lyla reached into her pocket, pulled out a stone, obsidian, polished, gifted by Redmond. She crouched, dug a small hole with her fingers, placed the stone gently inside, and covered it. A marker, a promise, a point on the map. Walken de Weilben and der Ong, and feud of the masker. When she stood again, the horse's ears flicked. Just once, a blink of recognition, and then, he turned. 1 fluid motion, and disappeared behind the rise. Not galloping, not fleeing, just leaving. Like the ending of a sentence you didn't need to hear to understand. Thanks for watching, and mid of the piece of present, Aspiriat Fermanal. And it is a commonly, Lyla didn't chase. She stood there for a long time, longer than the wind, longer than the sun, then turned back. So what it for more getting a 10 weight of the past, and the Penarian, Sam was waiting at the bottom of the hill. Their eyes met. No words, just a nod. Sam extended her hand. Lyla didn't take it, but she walked beside her, step for step, all the way back. Is not so, there were land of the terms the round where. At the party, the candles were relit. The kids cheered. Someone sang too loudly. The cake was slightly lopsided, but Lyla smiled. A real one, not wide, not loud, but deep. Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching. Later that evening, after everyone had gone, Sam found her on the back steps, barefoot, dust on her ankles, hair wild. Sam sat beside her, said nothing, just watched the sky turn into ash. After a while, Lyla spoke, soft, but certain. He came. Sam nodded. I know. Bitterin of the down that of the down the calls and rather. That's the stories of the comment formation. They sat in silence, shoulder to shoulder, until the stars arrived. Not all at once. Just like him, one by one. Quiet, steady, true. And that stayed, and that wanna matter formations, and the rate matter formo. And on that hill, just beyond the reach of light, a faint shimmer lingered. Not a shape, not a sound, just a warmth that refused to die. The flame in the sand. Still burning, still waiting, still home. It didn't go viral because it was strange. It went viral because it was honest. The clip of the fire horse, still, unwavering, planted outside the window of an old woman's forgotten house, spread like a quiet revolution. Not with hashtags or stunts, but with stillness. The stillness that made people stop, look, ask questions they hadn't allowed themselves to before. Why didn't it walk away? What did it know that we don't? What kind of love just stands there, asking for nothing? And, most haunting of all, why can an animal show devotion we fail to show each other? The video became a mirror. People stared, and some couldn't look away. With an ask-goer, but would I do that? National news anchors spoke in hushed tones over the footage. Some say it's a hoax, but no one can explain how a wild horse traveled that far. No one can explain why it stayed. Online forums lit up with arguments, conspiracy theories, essays from theologians, biologists, and children. A journalist from Chicago wrote, "It wasn't the horse that broke me, it was the window." The idea that someone or something could love you enough to just stay, even when no one else does. That quote made it onto a t-shirt, then onto murals, then onto walls of schools. Thanks for watching, and for my last of this, and it wants to make a load and a mass of this, and then came the art. Thousands of drawings, from Ohio, Maine, Arizona, Japan. A boy in Nebraska mailed Lyla a crayon sketch of the fire horse walking beside a little girl holding a lantern. He wrote in careful letters, "I think he didn't leave because she had a light inside her." A classroom in Oregon started a project called Compassion Without Words, where students made sculptures of animals standing beside people, not galloping, not roaring, just being there, quiet, present. And the rast for, not notifor, the town noticed. Not all at once, but it shifted. Small things. Eyes that had once narrowed when they saw Sam or Lyla in the market now held longer, warmer. The art teacher at the local elementary school added a new elective, Kinship in the Wild. The first project, draw someone who stood beside you, even if they didn't speak. Children filled pages with pictures of dogs, cats, grandparents, strangers, and one girl, even her little brother, who'd once held her hand in the dark. Someone proposed a statue. No city funds, just community donations. Anonymous at first, then not. Redmond carved the frame by hand. No artist's ego, just memory and quiet conviction. The sculpture stood 10 feet tall, planted in the center of the square that used to host rodeo flyers and foreclosure notices. The fire horse, head bowed, eyes open, still, and it stad and out a glading. The lection beco, with the lection because of the pastor a better, they unveiled it in silence. No ribbon cutting, just wind. Lyla was there, in a simple dress. Hair braided loosely by Sam. She didn't approach the statue. She stood across from it, watched, waited, and placed her hand on her chest. Left side, same as always. A second later, a dozen children followed suit, one by one. No prompting, no performance, just presence. The square held its breath. And with her 60-mile dot complete, Sam and Eric stood behind her, Eric's arm around Sam's shoulders, his other hand resting gently on Lyla's back. And that's when they said it. Soft, quiet, unshakable. "She's ours," Sam whispered. Eric nodded. "She always was." They filed the paperwork 2 days later. There were no objections, no red tape. Even the state officer who reviewed the file smiled and said, "Looks like the kid chose you first anyway." Thanks for watching, and watching in a Reading case. The Reading 7, Alma never saw the statue, but she saw the shift. Sam brought her the news at the nursing home, hands still ink-stained from signing the adoption forms. She leaned close to Alma's ear and whispered, "She's ours. It's official now." Alma didn't speak right away. Her eyes fluttered open, slow but clear. Then, with great effort, she gestured to the nightstand. A matchbox sat there, next to an old ceramic candle holder that hadn't been lit in years. Sam struck a match, lit the candle, set it beside her. Alma stared into the flame for a long time. then rasped, "You were right." Sam blinked. "About what?" Alma smiled, lopsided and broken, but beautiful. "Fire's not just to burn. Sometimes it's to warm. Ask Odin Ahar. The comin' to." Later, Lyla came in, held her grandmother's hand, didn't cry, didn't ask why the flame flickered that way. She just sat and let the silence hold them both. "But I do have to mace." That evening, as dusk kissed the edges of the desert, Sam sat on the back porch. Lyla curled next to her. No words, just stars. And in the soft distance of twilight, a coyote howled not with hunger, but with memory. Sam looked out across the dunes. The wind had shaped the sand into new patterns, like waves, like flame. Ask Aim, the brocays with a new and infacted. They were too highland affacted of this. Eric came out with 2 mugs, set one beside Sam, ruffled Lila's hair. She asleep? Number. But Lila's eyes stayed closed, breathing steady, chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm with the breeze. Thanks for watching. Redmond. 1. Sam whispered. Do you think it'll come again? Eric looked toward the hills. I think it never left. She smiled, then asked a question she hadn't dared to say aloud until now. Why us? Eric took a sip of his coffee, thinking, then said, maybe it saw the same thing we saw, someone who deserved someone to stay. That's completing last from the proud. And there, in embankment, the proud act in. Inside the house, the candle beside Alma's bed burned low, but didn't go out. 1 year. 365 sunrises since the day the world changed, not with a roar, but a whisper. Since the silent figure stood on a sand dune and taught a fractured community what love without demand could look like. It was Lila's 8th birthday. She didn't ask for a cake this time. Didn't ask for candles or colored paper or classmates whose eyes still watched her with the weight of legend. She just asked Sam for a morning walk, alone, to the hill. Sam didn't argue. She only tied the girl's shoes a little tighter than usual and kissed the crown of her head like she was sending her out to sea. Out of the masky as my furred, and by long, the sand was cooler than last year. It held the memory of dew and the long exhale of night. Lyla walked without looking back. Her hair had grown, her shoulders too. Not taller, just steadier. She reached the top without hurrying, without fear. She stood in the exact spot where the fire horse had once looked at her and said nothing, and in doing so, said everything. Thanks for watching. That was the serm of the unforgettable. That was watching be a fast. This time, he wasn't there. There was no sound of hooves or heat in the air, no shimmer of amber, no breath held in the throat of the wind. But the sand beneath her feet told a different story. Fresh prints, deep, wide, pointed straight at where she stood, then gone. And a mind like them, there continue 8 neater scores. No gallop marks, no retreat, just arrival and stillness. And then, nothing. The ghost of a presence that didn't need to be seen to be known. Lyla crouched, ran her fingers along the edge of one print, still warm. Thanks to racked another Rufix. A few on with the collar. She didn't cry. She didn't call out. She simply closed her eyes, lifted her face to the sky, and let the wind speak. Not in an Alcetici. That's a Gruben of the Pard. The recible and resigree, it danced around her like a familiar hand, lifted a strand of her hair, brushed her cheek, carried a scent she couldn't name but had always known. Dust, salt, ash, and something like honey warmed by firelight. Her lips parted, not to speak, just to feel, and she smiled, a soft, sure smile, like someone hearing an answer they weren't expecting but knew was right. Thanks for watching, and the Save the Manable spirit it as Rabble did. A mate of the starred, and Rabble did. Back in town, preparations were underway. No one had called it a holiday, not officially, not yet. But every the 17th of July, people began to gather. They brought candles, not to protest, to remember. They wore muted colors, carried no signs. There were no speeches, just music, low, wordless. Children brought their drawings. Some taped them to the sculpture in the square. Others carried them up the hill and left them in the sand. And that radiantly de water us os. That is no 80 in self fast. That radiantly depings p. And of course, that radiantly depings mady of the ras. The town called it the Day of the Silent Flame. It began as a whisper, a thank you without a direction, a prayer without a god, just a collective ache turning itself into gentleness. No politicians showed up. No brand sponsored it. It wasn't on calendars, but people came because they needed to. In with now us. I would my passer, and I wouldn't have fasting. That year, a teacher from Los Angeles drove 8 hours with her students. They set up a booth where passersby could write letters to anyone or anything that had stayed for them. Some wrote to their dogs, others to friends who never gave up. One man, shaking, wrote a letter to his younger self and burned it quietly behind the school. Thank you for watching, and it happened of the five. Thank you for watching, and then Apso from Lettel. On the hill, Lyla opened her eyes. The prints were still there, but already, the wind had started its slow work. She didn't try to stop it. Let the erasure be part of the promise. Not forgotten. Just woven back into the desert skin. For memor leaders the blah skies, and instated into new. And that's the rallers for herds, that wrote of the walls, and May doted. She stood up, brushed sand from her knees, took one step back, then another, then turned around. Down the hill, Sam was waiting. At a distance, not intruding, just present, like always. When the first end dated a brax, and if the proofed ready first, as the ride, Eric held Alma's wheelchair beside the truck. Alma's hair was thinner now, her voice softer, but her eyes still burned. When Lyla reached her, she didn't speak. She placed something in her grandmother's lap, a small cloth pooch. Inside it, a folded note, and a rock. Obsidian, smooth, worn. The note said only this: the flame stayed. So did I. Alma held it to her chest, didn't weep, didn't speak, just nodded, once, like the click of a lock sliding home. As the Adamanteria, that night, the town lit their candles, not in rows, not in rituals, just wherever they stood, at porches, in driveways, on back steps. Lyla stood with Sam and Eric on the hill behind their home. The stars were louder than usual, the moon quiet and whole. Eric handed her a candle. Lyla didn't light it. She held it, looked at it, then turned back to the sand, and smiled again, because she knew there are promises we never say, because we never have to. And one it reported with ass. The family one and and it's for now, and somewhere, beyond the reach of light and time, the fire horse stood, not waiting, not watching, just being, where the wind could find him, where memory could rest, where a child's heartbeat had once said, I see you, and yours had said, I'll stay. One and stated none of that, and see none of the played, in the flower, agsweapon, and nothing more needed to be spoken, because it already had been, in sand, and silence, and flame.